started. Thank you for coming. I'll turn it over to Dr. David Tanner. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, that's enough. I'm Dave Tanner. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you about some of the work that I did a really long time ago in graduate school. So when I was an undergraduate student, I knew I wanted to do something within the realm of biology, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I knew I kind of wanted to end up in academia. And then I took, towards the end of my career at my undergraduate institution, a course in entomology, which is the study of insects. And it captured my imagination. And then I read a book by a fellow named E.O. Wilson entitled The Social Insects. And it was just this book about how it is that insect societies could exist. And there are these societies that exist of hundreds of thousands of individuals with seemingly harmonious relationships. Anyways, it really interested me. So I knew I wanted to do something in graduate school with social insects. And I ended up working with a fellow who studied honeybees. And my training is as what's called a behavioral ecologist. Behavioral ecologists study behavior in the context of evolution and try and figure out how it is that behaviors have helped organisms survive over time. And there's a behavior that the honeybee does called the waggle dance. Unfortunately called the waggle dance. It really is called that, yeah. I do have a demonstration, though not by me. It was one of the many times my dad looked at me and shook his head when I told him I'm going to be studying like the dance of the honeybee. And what this behavior does is it allows honeybees to communicate vector information about a resource to a nestmate. And so vector information includes direction and distance to a particular resource out on the landscape. And it could be a portion of the landscape that potential recruits are completely unfamiliar with. And so they have to be relatively precise in how it is that they communicate this information. And to kind of jump ahead to the punchline, there's some inherent error in this communication, and that's really what I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand why there was this error in how it is that honeybees communicate. So what I thought I would do is show you what the waggle dance actually looks like, if my technology will work for me. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at this bee right here. She's a dancer, and the waggle dance consists of two phases, something called a waggle run, in which a bee walks in a relatively straight line while shaking her body back and forth very rapidly. And then she's going to return to that origin, the origin of that waggle run, via a return circuit. And then she'll perform another waggle run, and then she'll return to the origin again, though she'll turn out of the waggle run in the opposite direction, and it creates kind of this like figure eight sort of pattern. So let me show it to you. So we're going to be watching this bee here, and she does a waggle run, returns to its origin, another waggle run. So that's the waggle dance. Now, there are a few things that I need you to be aware of as you watch this. The first of which is the surface on which she's dancing. It's honeycomb. It's like this open, like holy surface. The other thing is there are some individuals that are following her waggle dance. And so be aware of these bees right here. They're collecting some information from this bee as she's performing this waggle dance. And the kind of information that she conveys is varied. There was some research that was done that suggests that like her body temperature indicates like how valuable the resource is, like how vigorously she's dancing indicates how valuable the resource is relative to the resources available in the hive. Okay, so generally speaking, this dance is done in a dark hive on a vertical surface that's open and pockmarked. But how does she collect that information? And then how does that dance actually encode information? Needs to be the next set of questions that we answer. So when a bee forages out on the landscape, what she does is she leaves her hive, this tree here, and she finds some resource out on the landscape. And she flies at some angle relative to the sun's azimuth. Now the sun's azimuth is just kind of the lateral direction towards the sun. And so if you and I were to leave the building, we were to face towards the sun and then point horizontally towards the sun, that's the sun's azimuth. And so in this scenario here, what a bee has done is she's flown 45 degrees to the right of the sun's azimuth to find this patch of flowers. And she communicates that 45 degrees to the right idea by returning to the hive, orienting her body on a vertical dance surface, rotating 45 degrees to the right or to the left, or how, sorry, this was to the left. I don't know my left and right just yet. So she flew 45 degrees to the left. She orients her body 45 degrees to the left of up, and then she performs a waggle run. Now, the way she's in the dark, right, and the bees that are following her dance are in the dark as well. And so the way that they're actually measuring gravity is with a set of proprioceptive hairs or pressure-sensitive hairs in between body segments. So there's some hairs that are located between the head and the thorax and the abdomen that they use to sense gravity. So think about what this poor bee has to do. She has to walk in a straight line on a vertical, oh yes, Bill, did you have a question?
I'm wondering if there are any versions of like otoliths associated with those hairs.
Versions of what?
Otoliths. Like
Explain what you mean.
We do balance in the inner ear with calcified rocks on hairs called cells we call hair cells.
Yeah.
Are there any calcified things on those that are helping with gravity?
That's a wonderful question, and the short answer is no. There's no calcification. It's purely just these little peg hairs. And when a body segment, and they can measure the deflection of that little peg hair, really is how they're doing it, by how much pressure body segments are placing against those hairs and the number of hairs that are being displaced and things like that. But that was a great question. So what she's doing, right, is she's on a vertical surface that's full of holes in the absolute dark while trying to measure gravity while stimulating these hairs while she's shaking her body back and forth very, very rapidly. It would be like me or you trying to walk across a dark gymnasium while shaking our heads back and forth very rapidly in a straight line, right? Like it's a tall order. So not surprisingly, she doesn't perform each waggle run perfectly. And this is particularly true for resources that are relatively close to the hive. Now there's this inverse relationship between the amount of error in a waggle dance, which consists of multiple waggle runs, and the distance of that resource from the hive. So the closer a resource is to the hive, the more error there is. The more distant that resource is from the hive, the less error there is, which is super interesting, and it's an observation I'll return to in just a second. But if you look at this diagram here, what this shows you is directions indicated by a waggle run following either a right return circuit or a left return circuit. So you can see that there are two clusters of directional information within this dance, right? Information that clusters around a left return circuit and information that clusters around a right return circuit. And what that creates is this angle. And we refer to that angle as the angle of divergence. Now, what's super interesting about the angle of divergence is if you were to take the bisector of that angle, that's the true direction to the resource. So it's as if the bees just aren't turning quite enough, right, in order to communicate the actual direction. So there was a group of scientists who were doing some work with this error back in the mid-90s. And the mid-90s was this time of, in evolutionary biology, of optimal foraging theory. And I won't bore you with it, but basically what it says is natural selection is going to work to optimize all behaviors and all aspects of our biology. And so what they did was they superimposed this idea of optimality on error. Error can only exist if it benefits the organism. And then kind of like provided a cute explanation for why there is decreasing error with increasing distance of a resource from the hive. So what they said was, perhaps natural selection has tuned this error so that bees are optimally distributed across an average patch size. Okay, so what these circles represent is average patch size, and those numbers in the middle of them represent distance. So if this represents the average patch size and you're trying to optimally distribute recruits across that patch, then your error needs to look something like that. That's what the divergence angle should look like, right? And then as you move that patch farther and farther from the hive, then divergence angle becomes smaller then smaller. So that's a cute explanation, right? But I didn't like it. And I didn't like it because what happens, right, if you're foraging or you discover a flower over here, or you discover a flower over here, 50% of the recruits that follow these dances are going to be outside those patches, and they're not going to find the resource at all, right? So in my mind, what made sense was, sorry, I just hit your microphone. What made sense was you give bees as precise information as you can, and then once they get into the field, if that resource has become locally depleted, then they begin to search around and they find other flowers. So that was my idea. Bees are dancing as precisely as they can, given the constraints of their dance. And maybe if we made the job of dancing a little bit easier for them, their precision would increase. Now, I should mention that this dance is performed for a variety of resources: floral resources, water, pollen, and potential nest sites. Yeah, Bill?
I was wondering if they do any communication for like hazards or danger?
Yes, they do. And they do that by stinging. So they won't alert necessarily the nest to potential threats until they begin stinging. And what they'll do is they'll release an alarm pheromone when they begin stinging, which causes other bees to target that same spot. And so if you're a beekeeper and you get stung once, the probability of getting stung multiple times in the same spot increases. It's really painful. Okay, so bees are dancing as precisely as they can, but think about the kinds of resources that they're dancing for. Floral resources, which are distributed, and then point resources like home sites. That doesn't exist as patch, it's point in space. Okay, so what I wanted to do was I wanted to see if I made the job of dancing for the bees a little bit easier, would their error decrease? So I created an observation hive. And observation hives consist of 2 bits of honeycomb, and they consist of about 2,000 bees, which is a very small number of bees for a bee colony. In like apiculture, bee colonies consist of anywhere between like 50 and 100,000 bees. So this is a really small colony. And what I did was I made it so that this observation hive, which had glass in between myself and the bees, could be rotated from a vertical position to a horizontal position. And then I exposed them to 3 different treatments. I allowed them to forage for resources, and I trained them to actually get to these resources so I knew exactly where they were when they were foraging at 3 different distances from the hive: 200, 300, and 400 meters. These black bars, these black bins, represent the divergence angle, average divergence angle for dances performed at resources at those distances on a vertical surface in the dark. And what you can see is the error is quite high, and there's this like decreasing relationship, right, of dance error and distance. Then what I did was I took that vertical surface and I rotated it horizontal so that they couldn't use gravity anymore, and I gave them a bright light to orient their dances by. And that's these gray bins right here on these top 2 graphs. And what you'll notice is that divergence angle decreased significantly, and there's no significant relationship between distance and divergence angle. So I gave them another signal to orient their dances by, and all of a sudden dance error went away. Then what I did was I allowed them to use gravity and light, and perform dances at the same distances. And you can see that when they had light available to them, that error went away. So, given another signal, bees were able to dance more precisely than they are using just gravity. But that doesn't really speak to the question of adaptability. This isn't how bees normally dance, right? Just because they can dance better doesn't mean that there's not some adaptive significance to distribution of recruits in the field. So the next question was, like, how do bees actually process information? Remember, the bisector of this divergence angle is the true direction towards the resource. And so do bees inherently have some algorithm that they use to take a whole bunch of information, determine a single vector, and then fly to that location? So that's the next experiment that I want to show you. What I did was I created another observation hive, in fact, multiple observation hives. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to quantify every bit of dance information performed by a dancer that I could, and I wanted to know who was following her dances. And so in order to do that, I had to individually tag all of the bees in this hive. So I individually tagged 2,000 bees. And the way that you do that is you take 2,000 bees and you stick them in the fridge for a while. It's a great trick. My wife, by the way, is terrified of bees. She absolutely hates bees. And our fridge for a while was full of bees. It was a touchy time for us, but we made it through. So we refrigerated these bees, and then you can purchase little plastic tags that you glue onto their thorax. And they're numbered and they have a color. And that got us to 1,000, but we needed 2,000. And so we also applied individual paint marks to their abdomens. And so they were marked in 2 ways. Then what I did was I created some traps so that I could capture bees that were out on the landscape. And the traps looked like this. This is basically like a movie theater popcorn bucket that's inverted. So it's about that big. And in the middle of this popcorn bucket, there is a little stand that holds some nectar. And it's a 2 molar sucrose solution. It's a really, really valuable, really high concentration sugar solution. And we scented it with essential oils, usually peppermint, so that bees could learn the scent really, really well. And then in order to give them access to the inside of this trap, we created some flowers that looked like this. We took plastic cones, or funnels like you would use to change your oil in your car, and I cut petals into them and bent them out to make them look like petals. And then I actually painted pollen guides, or to these arrows. What's interesting is if you take flowers and you apply filters to a camera so that you can see UV reflectance, many flowers actually have pollen guides that direct bees to where, or pollinating insects to where they're supposed to go to find floral resources. And so I painted those on my cones. So then I had to train the bees how to actually crawl up into the cones to get into the trap. And then once they're in there, what they were supposed to do, and they did, was they were supposed to fly up through a little wire mesh cone into an actual compartment that could be pulled off of this trap. So the reason that they did that is light would come down through another bit of mesh through the top of this little trappy part. And bees are positively phototaxic. They'll fly towards light. And so when they wanted to fly, they saw this light and they would fly up and out. And because it was a cone, they could go up through the cone but not crawl back down out of the cone. And then I set these traps out in an array that looked like this. And there were 40 to 50 traps set out depending on the experiment. And then what I did was I took a small number of these bees and I trained them to forage at a feeder located behind the center of this array of traps. And then I threw caution to the wind one morning, and I allowed my trained bees to go out to this feeder and then come back and start dancing. And I sat in this little plywood booth with a video recorder that could film in infrared because it was completely dark in there. And I filmed all of the dances. And I filmed all of the bees that were following those dances. And then what I had to do was I had to process all of that video, right? So I watched all of this video, and I learned that I count audibly when bees are doing waggle dances. And so I would count 1, 2, and I listened to myself count for a really, really long time. Okay. So what I knew, or what I had at the end of this, was all of the vector information that was collected by all of these potential recruits. And then we devised a number of models that may explain how it is they process this information. Perhaps there's a weighted average, right, where the last few waggle runs that they follow are more important than previous waggle runs that they've followed. Or maybe it's just a straight average. Maybe they take all of this information, this directional information, and they average it. Maybe they only use the last waggle run that they followed, or the first waggle run, or only waggle runs after a left return circuit, or a right return circuit, or whatever. So I tested all of these different models against what bees actually did, where they actually ended up along my array of traps. And what I found was that this average model best predicted how it is that bees process information. That is, when I looked at where a bee ended up, and I compared it to the waggle runs that she followed, the best predictor of where she ended up was a true average, which is super interesting, right? That bees, something with brains that are so very small, are able to take a set of very complex information, and then they're able to process that into an actual average. And so the take-home message is, bees can average. But what does that do to this actual hypothesis? What that does is it makes this error in the dance unimportant. Like it doesn't matter how large or how small that divergence angle is. What matters is the waggle runs that individuals follow, and then they're able to calculate a very specific trajectory from that. And with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you have about honeybees or the waggle dance. Yes, please.
Was that first video like the dance in real time, or?
Mm-hmm. Yep. The question was, is that a dance in real time? And yep, that's how quickly they dance. Yeah. Yes, please.
I see orange and eucalyptus trees up there.
Yes, ma'am. I'm in Southern California. Yeah. Not Wyoming. Yeah. So I did my graduate work at the University of California at Riverside. Yeah. Bill, and then Kaylee.
Are you aware of any examination of how they're processing this information in the brain?
I'm not. That's a really good question. Shortly before.
I'm wondering about how we process directional hearing. So, it's really odd. You're able to isolate the location of hearing, even though your ears are very close to each other. So you do it by transmitting information from both ears into the brainstem and timing where they arrive onto target neurons that are lined up in a row.
Interesting.
And so it just slightly faster from one ear ends up a little further where the two meet, and you understand that as some angle to your head.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, I cut you off.
Well, it seems like some similar anatomy could work in this situation.
And I wouldn't be surprised at all if you're correct, because what has to happen, right, is that those proprioreceptive hairs, those pressure-sensitive hairs, are communicating information differentially to the central nervous system. One of the reasons that insect central nervous systems, particularly for bees, wasps, and ants, is different than ours is, instead of having a single brain, they have a tripartite brain, where the part of the brain that's located in the thorax is almost exclusively concerned with movement of the limbs, and it's in the head that they're presumably processing this information.
So the dancer is using its bristles or hairs.
As are the followers.
Oh, the followers are also.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're not using their antenna primarily.
They'll use their antenna to collect other kinds of information, like the floral scent, like perhaps rapidity or the vigor with which an individual is dancing. But yeah, there's nothing pressure sensitive or gravity sensing associated with the antennae. Yeah, good question.
My question was
Yes,
not
ma'am.
as scientific. You said you made your traps smell like peppermint.
Uh-huh.
But isn't that usually like a bug deterrent?
So
Wouldn't it be like, I don't know, I've heard of
what,
bug
which,
deterrent.
Depends, I suppose, on which bugs you're trying to deter. It doesn't deter bees. So
Okay.
yeah, if you're using that to ward off bees. So bees are able to learn. It's called associative learning. They're able to learn a number of signals, one of which is olfactory and essential oils. And so peppermint, anise, lavender, things like that. Bees learn really, really well, and they can associate that with other things. They also use shape, color, stuff like that to associate with resources. Good question. Yeah, Sarah, and then please.
This might be a dumb question. It's dark in there. How does the bee follow the other bee to get the angle?
Yeah, I mean, you could, maybe you couldn't see, but they'll use their antennae to actually
okay.
touch.
They feel where the
Yeah.
bees going.
Oh,
See if it'll go again. So these bees are in close enough contact that you can see that she's actually antenating that bee.
And then they're reading the angle with their own hairs.
Correct.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Is there like one primary waggler? Do they all waggle? Does one waggle more than another?
That's a great question. And the short answer is yes, there is a primary waggler. I've never heard them referred to that way, and I love it. So the bee that finds that resource first will be the primary waggler, and she will continue to waggle and advertise that dance for as long as that resource is available. But this is a process of recruitment. So these individuals that are following her will fly out, find that resource, return to the hive, and then they'll also dance for it. Yeah. Clemencia.
Are there any, like, outliers that skew the data, like a naughty bee that like that just is like whatever, like you said to go this way, but I'm gonna do my own thing?
So like a bee that will follow that dance, but just decide she's not going to do it. Sure. What's even more naughty is you can have bees that are advertising for different resources, and there becomes like this competition for where you're going to devote most of your recruits to. That's particularly true for nest sites. So when bees find new nest sites, what they'll do is the colony will split and they'll create a swarm. And a swarm is just a cluster of bees that find some intermediate roost. And then they'll perform dances on the surface of the swarm. And recruits go out and they try and find like different home sites, and then they come back with some qualitative measure of those home sites. And then they advertise that qualitative measure in vigor of dancing. And you'll get like factions on the swarm. Yeah, good question. I've never heard of them referred to as naughty bees, but I like that as well.
You have to rewrite your paper.
Yeah. What other questions do you have? Well, this was wonderful. Thank you very much.
That was great.